So kind. What a gift to be with you this morning. I am so privileged to be here. And I was saying it yesterday. This morning, what a stunning backdrop of your world that you live in. My goodness, you look around and there's just beauty all over the place. It's just, I don't know if you get used to it, bored with it. Move to Illinois for like a minute and you will appreciate everything you have, including sun, because it's a big deal. And no, it's been an incredible couple days, and I pray that God will continue to do the same here. This has been such a hospitable environment, and I'm thankful for that. But let's turn our hearts to prayer, can we? Father, it is your time. That's what preaching time is. It's your time, and it's a miraculous time. And I'm always struck by the oddity of that we gather in this place and we reach back to a text that was written thousands of years ago, and not primarily to us, though it travels through time to us. And the beauty of this is that this text that was written so long ago shows up again in these relevant ways, and not because any woman or man who preaches is that good, but because your spirit is that faithful. And so when your word meets your spirit and it goes to your people, it can really do anything. And when it does that anything, we call that a miracle because we recognize it as the work of God. So may your work be witnessed in this place as you do what only you can do, changing lives in the way that only you can. And I, as a conduit of that, recognizing the deficiencies I have, knowing that you are faithful to make up what I'm lacking, will trust you because we need to hear a good news word today. And so, Lord, may we just trust you. May we give you praise in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, as was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. And all of God's people said, amen. Amen. Well, I want to share with you a story today. And the story that I want to share with you today, I'm going to confess something on the front end. And that is that the she in the story that I'm going to be talking about, I've unwittingly and unintentionally, but too often treated her unfairly. Even in my moments or attempts to correct or remedy my mistreatment, I've compounded it based upon holding too tightly to assumptions I've had about her. Have you ever been in one of those situations where you've heard a story told so many times that no matter how many times you try to break out of that story, you just keep imagining or seeing the story the same way? That's how I treated her. I would have probably told you that she was desperate, if not a bit helpless. I would have maybe said she was resilient. I would have probably communicated to you that she was shrouded in shame. And I'm almost confident that I would have somehow at least alluded to the idea that she was in search of sort of a white knight rescuer to come in and save the day for her, which is what I imagined had happened in this story. And then I met her again for the first time. You ever had that where you sort of meet someone again, but it feels like the first time? And I met a woman who was a little less helpless and a bit more gritty. Someone who had a few miles of road up under her wheels and who probably didn't look as sheepish as I had imagined. See, we find her story in John chapter 4. We call her the woman at the well, as though any particular episode in someone's story is indicative of their entire story. But I'd been so accustomed to hearing her told a certain way that I would have imagined her as this sort of quiet, timid, meek soul, sort of shuffling sheepishly with her head hanging low towards a well. That's how I would have imagined her, right? This sheepish woman. And yet this time, the time that I met her again for the first time, she looked a lot less like that sheepish, timid soul, kind of shuffling to the well, and more like women that I grew up around. Y'all know the women I grew up around. You just didn't know you knew the women that I grew up around. They're the kind of woman that has the cigarette hanging from the corner of her mouth. The kind of woman who has her hair put up in that weird combination between a cheap perm and too much Aquanet. The kind of woman who on her absolute best days looks at you and says, I'm not impressed. And on her worst days, she is, don't try me. You all know the kind of woman that I'm talking about. She'd been bruised and battered by life, and she was not about to stride into a situation where she was going to play the role of a fool. So when she alone stumbles upon this well and meets Jesus, a man who, according to John's gospel, was where he should not have been, who was ultimately going to end up talking to someone that he shouldn't have talked to, when she meets a man like that, I don't think she's sheepishly shuffling to the well. I think she sees him and does what the women that I grew up around would have done. That's what I think. I think she would have seen this man and been suspicious. I mean, come on, this wasn't her first rodeo. Life had tested her, and she's not going to stride into a situation all vulnerable without first surveying the landscape that she was entering into. She was suspicious of his presence regardless of his intention. And I think that's the key. The burden of proof of whatever reason he was there would have laid on his shoulders. Because this is a woman who wasn't going to be duped by too good to be true news, right? This is a woman who was going to a well at a time of the day when you don't go to wells, by herself, which is what you don't do because scoundrels hang out at wells. And it's possible that something could have happened. But she was intentional about going there at this time. So I don't think she just strolls into this situation all helpless and meager. In fact, we pick up our story in John 4. These are the words in John 4, starting in verse 7. When a Samaritan woman who came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" And his disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." When he's asking for a drink, I think her suspicion gets the better of her. I think her question in her mind is, who are you? What's your agenda? Why now? And why me? I think suspicion's a very real thing, especially for people who come toting good news. In 2019, my wife and I, after almost 2 decades of pastoral ministry, moved into the heart of the city of Chicago as urban missionaries. We arrived on a Monday. Now, here's interesting. When you move as a pastor from one church to the next church, there's always a church ready to receive you, right? They're eager, they're glad they may even put like food in your cabinets or something. They're excited that you show up, at least for a minute, right? When you show up as missionaries to a city of 2.7 million people with no church to catch you, no one cares. So my wife and I, we arrived on a Monday, and on Tuesday morning, 6:30 in the morning, our little condo, we had moved from a house to a tiny little condo in the city, and the condo is still packed with boxes, and at 6:30 in the morning, I'm putting on my backpack. And my wife said, she rolled over and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to the well." She said, "What?" I said, "Honey, I got to figure out where people are." I mean, you know that's what a well is, right? The well is the places in this world and in our lives, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, where people's lives engage one another, where people's lives cross paths, where people do business, where relationships are forged, where bridges are built, where connections are made. That's where the wells are. I said, I gotta go find a well. She said, "Okay," and went back to sleep. I had to go to find a well because of a verse that comes before the verses that I just read to you. The verse that comes before the verses I just read to you starts in verse 4, and it says this, that Jesus had to go through Samaria. Now, can I say something in the fear of being a little sacrilegious? I don't mean to be. That's actually not true. Jesus didn't have to go through Samaria. He was on the southern part of Israel, needed to get to the northern part of Israel, and geographically, Jesus did not have to go through Samaria. There was a well-trodden path that most Jews went that took them around. It added a little bit of time to your travel, but it took them around Samaria because people skirted Samaria because you avoided Samaria. You didn't go through Samaria because that's not a place where good Jews went. So when it comes to geography, he didn't have to go through Samaria. So if the Bible says that Jesus had to go through Samaria, it evidently means that there's a different compelling reason as to why Jesus had to go through Samaria. And it's interesting because there's only a couple times that it mentions that Jesus had to do anything. And in those moments, it's almost as if the heart of the Father was compelling Jesus to do what Jesus had to do. So if Jesus had to go to Samaria, it had nothing to do with geographic proximity or convenience. It had everything to do with the heart of the Father that sends Jesus to places that other people try to avoid, to people that other people try to ignore. If Jesus had to go to Samaria, it's because the love of the Father compelled him to go to Samaria. If he had to stop at the well, it's because the love of the Father compelled him to stop at the well. Now, here's where it gets problematic. As disciples, those who apprentice the Master and pattern our lives off of Jesus through the power of the Spirit, if Jesus has to go through Samaria, then we, as disciples who pattern our lives off of Jesus, have to. Okay, I'm just making sure we're tracking. You're arriving at the same conclusion I am. If Jesus had to go to Samaria, had to go through the Samaria, had to go to the well, then we as disciples have to go to the well. We have to, compelled by the same love that Jesus is compelled by, go to the spaces and places that others would seek to ignore to reach the people that others would seek to avoid. But here's the deal. When we get there, we shouldn't expect eager reception. See, I think this is what befalls many Christians. We get up the gumption to say, you know what, I'm going to do what Jesus does, and I'm going to go to the well, and I'm going to love on people, and we show up, and they're like, I don't care. And we get our feelings hurt. Here's the deal. We should anticipate suspicion. We should anticipate that we live in a world where people are not as eager to buy into good news because a lot of times it just sounds too good to be true. People aren't eager to buy into our good news no matter what our intent is because what we've sometimes demonstrated to them hasn't been that good. So when we go, we should anticipate that their reception won't be as eager as we had hoped for. Now, I got to say something. I don't mean to be skeptical here because I tend to believe that the news that we have is the best news that could be told. I think it's the best story that's ever been told. In fact, I wrote an entire book called The News is Good. I believe in this news. I believe that when Jesus came to earth proclaiming a message that says the kingdom of God is at hand, it's so close you can almost get your hands on it. What he's saying there is that the space where God gets God's way, where redemption happens, the space where the left outs are invited in, where the broken and the battered and the weary and the wounded find rest and healing for their souls, where the problems and brokenness and injustice of this world are challenged, and where God's peace and shalom reigns is at hand. I think that's good news. That's good news. I was a recipient of that good news. I came to faith at 25 years old. Former atheist alcoholic came to faith at 25 years old because of that good news. I actually didn't come to faith in fear of hell, I was already living in my own hell. I came to faith because of the promise of what could be, the change that could be, the good news that had met my life, the promise of redemption and salvation. I came to faith that way. So I'm all about good. And then when God rescued me, He dropped me into this church, this group of Nazarene. I never knew what a Nazarene was. My wife said, we're going to go to Nazarene church. I said, Nazarene what? But God deposited me in this church of I call them rabid good newsers. These folks were so committed to the good news, and it wasn't like just the pastoral staff. It was everybody. Like, there was this woman named Annette. She cut hair. She would always talk about, I've got the best job in the world because I have people captive for like 2 hours. And I just saw people sharing good news all the time, and it was infectious, and I thought, everybody does this. Then I went to churches and I realized not everybody does this. So I believe in good news. The problem is, unintentionally, we've not always made the news as good as it should be. See, sometimes we've made the good news not so good because we've wrapped it in our political banners. And we make people pass our political litmus tests in order to see it as good news. And we forget that part of what the good news is that we have a kingdom that is not of this world and a Lord that is not present right now, but who will return to claim us as His own. And to whom my allegiance goes to first and foremost. I think we've made the good news not so good when we've made it good for some, but maybe not for others. Meaning that maybe there's some that are just too far gone, too far outside the scope of redemption that it can't meet them there. And so the question is, if it's not good for all, then is it really good for any? And then I think sometimes we made the good news not so good when we have neglected or failed to care for the needs of our neighbors, the struggles they have faced, the brokenness that they've endured, the very real challenges to their dignity. I think sometimes we've made the good news not so good when we have forgotten that there are people who have experienced a lot of church trauma. Sometimes they've been in spaces and places where the church should have been grace and help and hope for them, and what it became was devastatingly broken to them, and it left them damaged as a result. And then I think we have to realize that there's just people out there whose lives have stacked up tragedy after trauma after tragedy after trauma, and they are not eager to play the fool of entering into a space where it feels like this promise of good news is going to be just one more too good to be true. So regardless of our intention and how good of the news that we think that we convey, the burden of proof rests on our shoulders. Which means we have to have a very deliberate kind of posture if we are going to be able to step into space with people and demonstrate just how good the good news is. This is why I love Jesus. Because if I as a disciple am called to pattern my life off of Jesus, He provides some pretty good patterns. This is why I love Jesus. In fact, I think Jesus in this story provides to us what it means to embody what I believe we are called to be, which is to be good newsers in this world. I believe He gives a great pattern. I think Jesus understands that if we are in fact going to be good newsers, that it takes time to cultivate the soil of our connections, sow seeds of love and trust, water with grace and compassion, fertilize with empathy and peace before it blooms. We got to be patient. It takes time. And then we've got to live out the pattern of Jesus. Can we just have a little fun to explore this story real quickly just for the pattern of Jesus, like how He does it? Would that be okay? We got time for that? Yeah. So let's look at His pattern in this story. The first part of His pattern that I'm about to tell you is going to be so obvious that you're going to look at me and you're going to go, yeah, do they pay you to do this kind of thing? So number one, first part of the pattern, Jesus shows up. And you're thinking, thank you, Captain Obvious. I don't think that's as obvious for Christians as we make it seem. Because here's what I think as Christians, we are really good at opening our doors for them to show up, but we're not always that great taking the first step and going to them to show up. See, good newsers don't wait for them to arrive. Good newsers recognize that the heart of the Father compels us to go out to the spaces and places where lives intersect, wherever we live, work, and play, wherever we are in our communities, neighborhoods, schools, and families. And we go to where they are and we show up. And we show up consistently, and we show up patiently, and we show up very present, recognizing that each person that we show up to has the dignity afforded to those who bear the image of God, and we camp out and we stay patient. We show up. Where do you need to show up? Jesus showed up at the well. Where's your well? Where's the well? Wherever you live, work, and play. That there are people who need you to show up and to be present. Now, the second thing, I love this part. This is one of my favorite parts. Jesus, I want you to hear this. Jesus anticipates reciprocity from the beginning, meaning this. Not only did Jesus have something for her, he believed she had something for him. Jesus actually believed that she could be a blessing to him. I'm thirsty, can you give me some water? See, I think too often when Christians, when we go and show up, we come as those who have all the answers and all the goods, and all they are is passive recipients of what we have to give them. And what we fail to recognize is that God had stitched them together in their mother's womb, and they are beautifully and wonderfully made too, even if they don't know that or realize it, and that they may actually have something to bless me with. You know why that matters? Because that's when true friendship is forged. That's when real connections are made. When we can look at someone and say, I think you're a gift to me, not only am I a gift to you. And we value them, and friendship is the soil from which the good news begins to grow. The third thing I love about this story and the pattern of Jesus is that Jesus is aware of the moments that he can hint at the good news without sort of overwhelming for what's appropriate to the moment. Again, this is like Christianity 101 for us. We're like, okay, I'm going to go to the well, I'm going to get my training, and when I arrive, I'm going to tell them what they need to know, and we come in with all guns ablaze, and we're like, I'm going to tell you some good news. And people are like, whoa, can you get to know my name first? Jesus doesn't overwhelm. He just sort of like drops in these moments, sows the seed. Hey, can you give me a drink? You're a Samaritan. Or, I'm a Samaritan. You're a Jew. You can't ask me for a drink. He's like, if you knew who it was that was asking you for a drink, you'd have asked him because he'd have given you living water. He's just hinting at this good news. There's moments when you forge meaningful relationships that you're going to be given opportunities to hint at good news. And then the next one, this one I think is imperative for us to understand. Jesus is curious about her story without condemning. I love this part of the story. Hey, while we're talking, can you go get your husband? And she's all like, funny you should ask. I don't have one. And he's like, no, I get it. You've had 5, and the one you're with currently is not your husband. Now, here is where I have done her story the most damage. I have too readily, and I mentioned this yesterday, I've too readily read her story like a 21st century story. When you think of a woman who's had 5 husbands and the man that she's with currently is not her husband, what do you think of her? Don't say it out loud. That would be bad. We're in church. But you thought it. Yeah, her story is not a 21st century story. Do you know in her story she would have had very little agency over her own life? She would have been the victim of a system that was designed to see her fail and to steal her and rob her of dignity. In fact, my guess is, there's all sort of conjecture of how this could have happened, but biblical scholars believe that there's some reasons here. Probably that she was married off very early, very young, and being married off very young, her older husband probably died. She was then shuffled to a brother who may have been displeased with her, and he could have issued her a divorce certificate, which would have left her damaged goods, which probably would have positioned her in a marriage that was not healthy, probably one that could have been abusive to her, which is the only reason that she could have then issued a divorce decree. And then after that, maybe she would have entered into another unfortunate relationship where he died, she shuffled off to another man, and then finally ends up with a man who won't be married to her because maybe his kids are against it because she becomes a threat to their inheritance. Do you know that the people that we encounter at the well, the places where people try to avoid to go to the people that others seek to ignore, do you know they have a backstory? That whatever we see in their lives, whatever brokenness that is happening in their lives, there's a backstory there. And we would do well to be curious enough to be concerned about it without condemning them for it. And demonstrating that kind of compassion. The next one I find fascinating is, see, I've been a pastor for so long that you'll start getting close into someone's life. Go get your husband. You have this little dance about the husband, and then people want to get all theological on you, right? Like you're in a conversation, like you're really getting in deep with someone's life, and then they're like, "Tell me about the Trinity." And she's like, "By the way, we Samaritans worship on this mountain, you Jews worship on that mountain." And she's, I love it. He fields her theological questions without feeling threatened. Could we do that? Meaning, like, when people disagree or doubt what we believe, can we not come out punching? Can I just give you freedom here? God has been doing God stuff for a really long time. This person who's taking shots is not the first person to call into account God's authority. He can defend himself pretty well. We can actually field people's questions and doubts and concerns without feeling threatened ourselves. Still very much forging in that relationship of trust. And then finally, in this pattern of Jesus, there is a moment where Jesus is absolutely clear about this message. She goes, there's coming a time when the Messiah is going to come and he's going to make all things known to us. And Jesus is like, that would be me. She's one of the first people that Jesus reveals his full identity to. And then I love what happens next. This woman who was like this, now's like, sets her bucket down. Just a minute, I will be right back. Stay here, and she's off. Back to her village, to the people that she sought to avoid. Because the natural implication is that when you receive the good news like Jesus gives, you can't help but give it to others. It has to go out to others. You have to go out to other people. And I think this is the profound truth of the Scriptures, is that when the news becomes that compelling, it compels us to go out. Jesus provides us the pattern. Good newsing requires a posture and a presence that disarms suspicion through patience and building trust and extending empathy and demonstrating love. So I went down to the coffee shop, to the well, 6:30 in the morning, 2 blocks down from my house, and I sat down and I pulled out my Bible, my journal, and a book that I was reading, and I just sat there, and by 9:30 in the morning, I had 15 people gathered around my table was talking about Jesus. That's not true. It was Chicago. No one cared that I was there. And no one cared. So you know what I did the next morning? I went back. And the morning after that, I went back. And every morning for weeks, I went back and sat in that same booth and did the same thing. Because I began to realize something, that even in a city of 2.7 million people are creatures of habit. And they go to the same wells. So I began to realize there was regulars. I still remember the day when I realized I had made it. Dudes in this place, you'll understand what I mean about. You know when you've made it as a dude? You get the head nod. Y'all know what I'm talking about. So I remember sitting in my booth, and this guy who I'd seen multiple times, he was a regular. He's standing at the counter. He gets his cup of coffee. He turns, he sees me, and he does this. And I was like, and internally I was like, yeah, I am in. Then there was my friend. She was coming in all the time as well, only her circumstances were a little different than mine. I'm an empty nester. I was sitting with my Bible and my journal and my book, and she had 2 toddlers under 4. Much different circumstance. The level of peace that she and I were experiencing were a little different. She comes in, and we had been for a couple weeks, kind of waving, saying hi, doing that thing. And then she's a lot more gregarious than I am, so she just walks over, and she goes, okay, seriously, who are you and what do you do? And I said, well, that's a great question. I said, I'm a professor, and I teach the convergence of religion and culture, which is what I do. I didn't lead out with, I'm a pastor, and, and she looks at me, and she goes, oh, that's fascinating. I'm an atheist. And I went, okay, all right. She, established that on the front end. So we had this great talk. The next day, we had another talk. And then she and I became fast friends. So she and my wife became fast friends, and I became fast friends with her husband, and they're just amazing people. We became uncle and aunt to their kids. Before she left Australia, she was named among the who's who in her region of people in their 20s because of the work that she had done for people with disabilities. And so I was in multiple conversations, tell me about your heart for disabilities. Her husband did global business, and I'm annoyingly curious. So I wanted to ask him all these questions, and he would field my questions. And we just had these great conversations and great relationship for us. And then COVID hit. And shut down my coffee shop. Now some of y'all were like, shut down my church. My coffee shop was my church. And I couldn't go to church. Because that's where I was connecting with people. So we saw some ways around it. So we had corner coffee dates. So a few of us from the coffee shop, we'd get our coffees, and then we'd stand on the corner about 6 feet away with our mask, do all that kind of stuff that we were doing during that time, and we were connecting. My wife and I, who had a lot more freedom than many of the friends that we had in the neighborhood, would go on donut runs where we'd pick up donuts, and then we would take it to the house, and we'd drop it on the front doorstep of the families who had kids, and we'd back away, we'd knock on the door, and the kids would run to the door, and they'd get their donuts, and we'd do that kind of thing, and we still maintained these relationships and friendships. I'll never forget, at one point, she and her son were walking through the neighborhood, and I get a text from her, and she said, my son just asked, they just passed St. Michael's, which is this beautiful cathedral in our neighborhood. We just passed St. Michael's, and he asked, what do they do inside of there? And my response to him was, you'll have to ask Uncle Jeff. Then she called me one night. She said, hey, would you and Angie come for dinner? I said, yeah, sure. She said, great, we're going to have charcuterie boards. Y'all know what a charcuterie board is? It's a thing. My grandma and grandpa used to call those meat and cheese plates. And I don't know if you know, I'm not a small feller. I don't know that I'm ever going to get full off of a meat and cheese plate. But I was like, sure, charcuterie, fine. So I went to the house and had charcuterie. And we're sitting there, and she asked my wife and I, she said, how did you meet? Now, I try to be incredibly respectful of people and where they are in life. So, but I can't tell them the story of how my wife and I met if I don't tell the story of how we came to faith. Because we came to faith 3 years after we were married in a really dysfunctional and broken marriage. And we wouldn't have a story to tell if we didn't tell about when we came to faith. We wouldn't still be together. So I get to that point, and I said to her, I said, and this is the part where we became followers of Jesus. And then to respect them, I moved on. And she stopped, and she said, stop it. And I was like, oh, man, I overshot the mark. I said, what? And she said, you tell me that. And I said, yeah? And she said, yeah, I want to know how an atheist alcoholic became a Jesus follower. And then in an unscripted, natural, bubble to the surface based upon real friendship, because she cared about me enough for me to share something so deeply meaningful to me, she gave me the opportunity to share the gospel for the next 30 minutes. And at the end of that, there was no huge moment except for that she says to me after hearing our story of, we have a pretty radical story of how we came to faith. And she says to me, you got to understand where I come from, we don't even have categories to make sense of the story you just told. Like, it's not on our rate. Like, we don't know how to, we don't talk about that stuff. But if that's a thing, maybe not today, but hopefully someday I'll have that thing. And I thought to myself, it's been over a year. Friendship, patience, showing up, caring, going to the well, before she loved me enough, cared for me enough, to trust me enough, to share the good news that was so central to who I am. I wonder if we as the people of God could be committed to Great Commission evangelism. The kind of evangelism that makes you a good newser. That you are compelled by the heart of the Father to go wherever you live, work, and play, among your family, your coworkers, your neighborhoods, your communities, to find out where people are and to show up and to care about them. And to make them a priority and take your time in doing it. Because I believe if you do that, it'll bubble to the surface and you can share the good news of Jesus. So where's your well?